So today I'm gonna push the boundaries a bit. Well, today we're gonna be talking about a very beloved show all across the world. But whether or not this show is actually anime is hotly debated. Personally, I don't believe it's an anime, but far be it from me to tell somebody who does believe it's an anime that it's not. If you weren't able to deduce just yet, I mean, you probably already knew what we were talking about. You clicked on the video. Today we're talking about Avatar: The Last Airbender. Well, not just Avatar: The Last Airbender, we're also talking about Korra. We're talking about the Avatar universe is what we're doing. See, Avatar: The Last Airbender and The Legend of Korra hold a very special place in my heart. And just because I don't consider them anime doesn't mean I don't adore them. And once again, I will reiterate, if you consider either of those shows an anime, hell yeah, dude, go for it. And since this page is me talking about and explaining the anime that I adore, I figured Avatar: The Last Airbender wouldn't be too far of a stretch. But the reason I want to talk about Avatar: The Last Airbender today is because Avatar: The Last Airbender has one of the most well-known power systems in the entirety of fiction. Bending, specifically the bending arts, are probably the most widely known ability in all of fiction. Every day I hear conversations about people wondering whether they be an airbender or an earthbender or a waterbender or a firebender. People discussing whether or not they like Korra or Aang more. Hell, it's the only anime that my girlfriend claims to have seen, and I give her that one. But while the bending arts might seem relatively straightforward, they're not really. See, obviously, yes, airbenders push air, firebenders push fire, and so on and so forth. But there's actually a very complicated and rich history to each of the individual bending arts. And there's also a lot of things people don't understand, like energy bending and how the original benders got their elements, who the first avatar was, how they closed off the spiritual poles, what happens if an earthbender and a firebender have a child, and so on and so forth. So today, we're doing the bending arts explained. Before we get to explaining anything, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. The bending arts, martial art techniques specific to certain nations that allow them to control an element that they're most in tuned to. But how does bending start? What is the energy system to bend? What nation has the highest chance of becoming benders? And what are the sub-skills of every bending art? Because while things like airbending may seem relatively straightforward, it also can possibly grant you the ability of flight and astral projection. But we're not gonna get into that quite yet. We're gonna start this video off in the way that we usually start these videos off, at the beginning. The story of Avatar starts in the era of Rava. This was a time before the cycle of avatars, roughly 10,000 years before the air nomad genocide, specifically 9,829 years. In this era, there was two incredibly powerful spirits locked in perpetual combat, and this was Rava and Vatu. Vatu was an incredibly evil spirit trying to drag the earth into a state of darkness, and Rava was a good and powerful spirit trying to prevent this. This fighting started when Vatu broke through the barrier that separated the physical world from the spiritual world. And when Vatu broke through this barrier, it created two spirit poles in the north and south poles of the earth. With these spirit poles open, spirits could now enter the physical world from the spiritual plane. And since these spirits were massively stronger than humans, they terrorized and murdered a lot of the human population, which led the remains of humanity to flee to the lion turtles to live on the lion turtles' backs. And since now the majority of humans lived on the backs of lion turtles, the rest of the world became known as the spirit wilds. And should the humans ever want to leave the back of the lion turtle to go get food, the lion turtles would bestow them with bending. See, each lion turtle was associated with a specific element, and that was the one element that a lion turtle could bestow to a human entering the spirit wilds. And upon returning from the spirit wilds, the humans would return their bending ability to the lion turtle. Not all humans and spirits battled each other. In fact, the humans that lived on top of the air lion turtle actually befriended them, which is what built the foundation for the air nomads 10,000 years later. But on the fire lion turtle, there was a man by the name of Wan. And Wan one day told the fire lion turtle that he was heading out to the spirit wilds, and thus the fire lion turtle bestowed him with firebending. However, upon returning, Wan didn't give the firebending back, effectively stealing firebending from the lion turtle. Wan would go on to use his firebending to help the poor and fight the rich, until eventually he was captured on the lion turtle and brought to, well, the lion turtle. However, the lion turtle let him keep firebending because he was banishing him to the spirit wilds forever. But it was in these spirit wilds that Wan began to live with the spirits, and while living with these spirits, Wan trained with a dragon to perfect is Firebending, being the first person to create the dancing dragon fire form. After perfecting Firebending, Juan went to go find other lion turtle cities. However, before Juan found any of these lion turtle cities, he stumbled upon two spirits fighting each other. These spirits were Rava and Vaatu, and Rava had Vaatu pinned, but Vaatu tricked Juan into thinking that Rava was evil, and therefore Juan got Rava off of Vaatu. After realizing his mistake, Juan trained with Rava. Specifically, Rava taught Juan how to master all 4 elements, because Rava was getting weaker and Vaatu was getting stronger. This is because there was more and more chaos being sowed into the world, and Vaatu was the spirit of chaos and darkness, and therefore Rava knew she only had one option: harmonic convergence, which would allow her to merge with Juan's spirit. However, in order for harmonic convergence to happen, all of the planets have to be aligned, and thus before the harmonic conversion, Juan challenges Vaatu to a battle, but Vaatu is too strong for Juan. However, during the middle of their fight, all of the planets align, and Juan calls out to Rava to merge with him, and in that moment their harmonic convergence makes them one, and this harmonic convergence creates the Avatar Spirit. With this new power, Juan is able to defeat Vaatu, and he seals Vaatu in the Tree of Time, an ancient tree located in the spirit world, directly between the North and South spirit poles. And after placing Vaatu in the Tree of Time, Juan closed off the spirit poles at the North and South poles, making sure that no human would ever be able to enter the spiritual realm to break Vaatu out of the Tree of Time. And with the beginning of the Avatar era, the lion turtles felt as though they were no longer needed as the protectors of humanity, and thus stated that they would no longer be giving bending to humans. So if the lion turtles weren't giving people bending anymore, how did people end up with bending? Well, we don't really know. Well, okay, we kind of know. See, here's the thing. The way that somebody ends up with bending is reliant on a massive amount of variables. Bending acquisition is very similar to genetics. Whether or not you are going to acquire bending is a bit like a genetic mutation. It's dependent on where you lived, who your parents were, what they ate, basically everything. So after the departure of the lion turtles, because the Avatar Spirit was now inhabiting the earth and the spiritual realms were closed, there might have been some people who happened to still have bending abilities from the lion turtles that they never had to get back, and those people naturally would have bred and conferred those bending abilities down to next generations, or it was energy bending. See, the Avatar is able to use energy bending, which we'll talk about a little bit later in more detail, but in summation, it basically allows an Avatar to either take or give bending abilities. So it's a possibility that Juan used energy bending to give a couple of people bending abilities, but all of that may not have even been necessary. See, bending is actually considered to be a recessive gene, meaning that those with 2 non-bending parents can actually be born benders. Look at Katara and Toph. This means that by simply having a bender somewhere in your previous succession means that you have a possibility of being born a bender. As to how those genes started, once again, we're not entirely sure. But on the other side of the spectrum, having 2 bending parents also doesn't guarantee you the ability to bend. Look at Aang and Katara's eldest son, Bumi. He came from 2 of the most powerful benders on Earth, and he has no bending ability. This is why bending is actually more complicated than it might seem, because it's not like chakra or magic where everybody has it. It's actually genetic, and genetics are messy, and Avatar does a very good job of showing that. And genetics play more of a role than just you have bending or you don't. See, once again, bending is very similar to real life genetics, where benders born from powerful benders will usually they themselves be powerful benders. It's like if both of your parents are 6'5", you're probably going to be pretty tall, but just because you're tall doesn't mean you're going to be good at basketball. There could be somebody who's born 5'7" who puts in significantly more work than you and becomes better than you at basketball. You just don't have to train as hard as them. Bending is exactly the same, but bending does have a small degree of difference from the basketball analogy. See, your proficiency in bending is largely tied to your spirituality, since bending is inherently listening to the earth around you and being in tune with it. Therefore, those who are truly not in touch with their surroundings will never truly master bending. And because spirituality is very key in whether or not somebody actually awakens to their bending abilities, the spirituality of a nation will have a direct tie to how many people in that population actually become benders. See, the only population on Earth where 100% of people born become benders is the air nomads. And that's because the air nomads are the most spiritual people on Earth. Because they're tapped into their connection with the spirits and have been for almost 10,000 years, every air nomad has the ability to airbend. However, the Earth Kingdom, which has the largest population out of all of the nations, has the smallest percentage of benders. And this is because the Earth Kingdom is the least spiritual. Now that we've been talking about all these different kinds of bendings, we're we're almost just about to the point where I start talking about the differences between them, but first I want to talk about the similarities. You see, all bending arts are based off of martial arts, and these martial arts are meant to mimic the elements that they're bending. Waterbending is a very flowy martial art, since water itself is inherently flowy, while earthbending is filled with swift and stiff movements to represent the strength of the earth. While the majority of bending is done using one's hands or feet, this isn't always the case. See, some incredibly practiced benders can actually bend just using movements in their torso or head. And even rarer than this is people who have the ability to psychic bend, meaning just by focusing hard enough on a task, they can bend materials around them with no physical movement. The only exception to bending arts mirror martial arts is energy bending, which requires next to no physical movement to do. And since energy bending plays a crucial and explainable role in the rest of the different kinds of element bending, we're gonna start there. See, all four elemental bending styles require the manipulation of chi. Chi is a natural energy flow system that exists within the human body. Think of it like chakra or curse energy or nen. Those who can control the flow of their chi can project it outside of their body. That is to say that well-practiced benders use the chi in their body to interact with their surroundings. And by saturating the surroundings with your chi, you're able to bend the elements that you are associated with, be that earth, wind, fire, or water. However, energy bending, which is specific to the avatar, allows you to bend somebody's chi. The best example of energy bending is when Aang took away Fire Lord Ozai's firebending. You see, not all avatars actually have access to energy bending. In fact, very few avatars have had the access, and even fewer have used it. And this is because energy bending is very dangerous. You see, when an avatar energy bends, they run the risk of being destroyed themselves. To explain this, I have to explain a little bit more about energy bending. See, there's two types of chi. There is pure chi and impure chi. Those who are completely in tune with the spiritual world and very good people have pure chi. And while those who are overly spiritual and might have made some bad decisions have impure chi. Only impure chi can be bended. And the reason this is dangerous for an avatar is because energy bending is a bit like a tug of war. Once an avatar goes to energy bend somebody, the person that they're energy bending can actually energy bend them back. And if the avatar who's trying to energy bend does have impure chi, the person they're energy bending can actually completely destroy them. However, Aang, who was raised an air nomad and was incredibly spiritual and also a very good person, had pure chi. And thus, when Fire Lord Ozai tried to bend Aang's chi, Aang was able to fight back and take his fire bending away. Energy bending's usefulness doesn't stop here. Energy bending can also restore the ability to bend. We saw in Legend of Korra that Korra was able to restore the bending abilities of those who had them blocked by blood bending. We also saw in Legend of Korra that energy bending allowed Korra to create a spiritual projection, something that's usually specific to highly talented airbenders. But speaking of airbending, let's get into all these different kind of bending natures, starting with airbending. You see, airbending was created by the flying bison and was taught to the air nomads by them. Airbending is arguably the weakest offensive bending art, but one of the strongest defensively. But when you consider those who use airbending, this makes a lot of sense. You see, airbending is mostly focused on evasion and non-fatal finishing moves. And considering the fact that it's only being used by monks, that makes a lot of sense. Now, 99% of the time, the mobility granted to an airbender comes in the form of a glider. You see, airbenders can manipulate the air around them to make their glider fly, simply by providing thrust and lift for their glider. Very rare circumstances, there's people who can fly using airbending that don't need gliders. I say very rare because there's only been 2 people ever to be confirmed to be able to fly without the use of a glider. 2 airbenders by the names of Lakhima and Zahir. Lakhima was born in 3829 BG, before genocide, and he discovered the trick to weightlessness that allowed him to fly. And he was so proficient in this flying technique that he spent the last 40 years of his life without ever touching the ground. He was also a renowned poet, so renowned that even thousands of years after his death, his writings were still read, specifically by Zahir. See, Zahir is a significantly less good guy. Zahir is the leader of the Red Lotus and an anarchist. Zahir essentially believes that the world needs to be reset, and that means getting rid of the White Lotus, the 4 nations, and the Avatar. And after the second harmonic convergence, which happened in 171 AG after genocide in Korra, Zahir himself became an airbender, and after reading the works of Lakhima, he severed his tie to the earth and discovered weightlessness, becoming the second ever person to gain the flight ability. Second subclass of airbending is spiritual projection, which outside of the confines of an avatar is even rarer. The only person who wasn't an avatar that we've seen be able to use this is Jinora. And this makes sense when you consider the fact that she's the granddaughter of Aang and Katara, and was also raised an air nomad. She's also within the confines of Korra, the youngest airbending master, and she's always had a preternatural connection to the spiritual world, being able to see spirits within the physical world, and thus being able to spiritually project allowed her to be Korra's guide in the spirit world. But since we're talking about Katara's grandkids, we should talk about waterbending. See, waterbending has a bit of a unique origin story when it comes to bending styles. While earthbending, airbending, and firebending were originally started by animals, waterbending's original bender was the moon, which makes a lot of sense if you actually think about it when you consider the fact that the moon is responsible for the poles on Earth, and therefore the moon's position is what's actually pulling entire oceans. You see, waterbending can be most closely compared to judo, because waterbending, while very versatile and adaptive, is more about using the energy of your opponent against them, and thus waterbenders have to take on their opponent's energy and try to redirect it at them. And while waterbending is cool and all, unfortunately there's not water everywhere, so the strength of a waterbender is usually largely dependent on how much water is around them. However, at the highest echelon, that isn't necessarily the case. See, a truly skilled waterbender can pull water from anywhere, because there is water everywhere. You may feel as though on a humid day you're walking through water, but at any given moment there is humidity in the air. Now obviously on a more humid day a waterbender would be surrounded by more water, but a truly practiced waterbender can pull water out of the air whenever. But waterbenders also have another massive advantage. Almost everything on Earth has water in it. Things like plants, which are mostly comprised of water, can be bended using waterbending. We saw this with the Foggy Swamp tribe, but waterbenders can do a lot more than just move and flow water. See, water can exist in 3 states: a solid, a liquid, and a gas. Those who are incredibly practiced in waterbending can force water into any of these 3 states whenever they want. That is to say, a waterbender can increase or decrease the temperature of water as they see fit, though I would more closely relate it to them increasing the density of the water than increasing the temperature, since ice is water's densest form while steam is water's least dense form. However, since the moon was the original waterbender, waterbender's ability is largely dependent on the moon. See, during a full moon, a waterbender will be the strongest they ever will be. However, during a lunar eclipse, a waterbender basically won't be able to waterbend at all. It's during these full moons that the subclasses of waterbending are most often seen, specifically blood bending. See, we as humans are 70% water. The rest is a little bit of carbon and a little bit of iron and like a bunch of other trace minerals, you get it. A waterbender at the peak of their powers is able to control that water in our body. And thus a waterbender can just completely stop the flow of blood in your body and kill you in about 5 seconds. Now, blood bending is incredibly taboo because it's not a very spiritual thing to do. But amongst all the bending types in terms of combat ability, it's probably the scariest, which is ironic because the other subclass of waterbending is healing. See, the way that healing works within the confines of the Avatar universe is critically underexplained. Most people just assume that somehow the water has a healing property that closes up wounds, but it's actually a lot cooler and more complicated than that. See, waterbenders are able to use water as a catalyst to tap into the chi system of a person they're healing. And by tapping into said chi system, they're able to redirect the flow of chi to an injured area to accelerate its healing. Now, obviously, there's going to be a spectrum of how good healers are. Those who aren't that great are able to use this technique on external wounds, while those who are truly great are able to use this technique on internal wounds and illnesses. And this is mostly because internal wounds and illnesses cannot be seen. But if I have a scratch on my shoulder, the waterbender healer knows where to direct my chi. On top of this, the quality of water used as this conduit to tap into the chi system is also very important. But quality of water doesn't mean that you're using Voss water over Poland Springs. It usually means how spiritual the water is, like spirit water from the Spirit Oasis in the North Pole. Since this water is inherently very spiritual, being able to tap into the chi system is a lot easier. I could do an entire video on healing in Avatar, and I probably will one day if this video does well, but for the moment, let's leave healing at that. And let's leave waterbending at that and move on to our next bending, Earthbending. See, the original Earthbenders were badger moles who would use Earthbending to make tunnels for themselves to crawl through. See, like we stated earlier, the Earth Kingdom has the largest population of people, but the smallest percentage of Earthbending. So how does one become an Earthbender? And in order to talk about that, we have to talk about Jing, not Chi, Jing. You see, Jing is a term that describes the amount of options one has during combat. During combat, you can either attack or you can defend. And according to Boomy, Aang and Katara's oldest son, there's 85 different types of Jing, but there's only 3 that are ever talked about: positive, negative, and neutral Jing. Positive Jing explains when you attack. It's an aggressive use of chi, and therefore positive Jing is most commonly used by firebenders who are mostly focused on offensive capabilities, while negative Jing explains defensive and evasive maneuvers, which is most commonly used by airbenders. Neutral Jing explains doing nothing, sort of. Neutral Jing can be surmised as waiting for your opponent to make the first move and finding the perfect counter action. Through seemingly doing nothing and analysis, neutral Jing allows you to find where to strike at the perfect moment, or where to evade to at the perfect moment. Earthbending is dependent on neutral Jing. And through neutral Jing, an earthbender can become one with the earth. And once a want-to-be earthbender has achieved neutral Jing, they can control the earth around them. But earthbending's reliance on neutral Jing is why most earthbenders don't move from the place they're bending in. That is to say, most earthbenders will stand still and throw rocks or use rocks as defensive walls. Only incredibly skilled earthbenders can move and earthbend simultaneously. Earthbending is considered to be the most perfectly balanced out of all of the bending arts, as focused on offense as it is on defense. And since it's built around fortitude and strength, it's considered to be the polar opposite of airbending. And it has 3 subskills: lava bending, metal bending, and seismic sense. See, seismic sense is largely tied into neutral Jing. Essentially, by becoming in tune with the earth, an earthbender is able to feel the vibrations around them to deduce the situation. This is essentially what Toph uses as a replacement for her vision, and it's why Toph doesn't wear shoes. It's essentially a sonar system that uses the ground as your sounding nodule. Now, seismic sense was created by badger moles, because badger moles were blind, spending their entire lives underground, and thus they would use the vibrations that they created and the vibrations of the earth to see where they were. But Toph wasn't the only person to use seismic sense. Toph taught Aang how to do it, and she taught her 2 daughters, Lin and Suyin. And then lava bending and metal bending are exactly what they sound like. Because both lava and metal are created from the earth, they can be bent by incredibly powerful earthbenders. And I know what you're saying. You're saying,
Nick, at what point do things stop becoming earth or start becoming earth?
I don't know. I would argue trees are earth, but only waterbenders can bend those. Earthbending is rocks and ores and rock and ore derivatives. Here's a real doozy. Who would be able to control Mercury? Would it be earthbenders or waterbenders? You tell me. And once you're done scratching your head over that question, let's pop on to our last bending form, Firebending. Firebending is the most aggressive out of all of the bending forms, which makes a lot of sense when you consider the fact that it was taught to the Sun Warriors by literal dragons. I mean, I guess technically it was taught to Wan before it was taught to the Sun Warriors, but that's fine. Firebending is arguably the least spiritual out of all the bendings, being entirely reliant on positive Jing. And because of this, firebending is almost entirely offensive, which makes sense when you think about it, because how would you use fire defensively? Fire is also different from the rest of the bending arts in a different way. See, firebenders, regardless of how good they are as firebenders, don't need an external source of fire. While it's nice to have an external source of fire around, it's not necessary. You see, firebenders use their internal temperature to create fires that they control. And because the fire was supposed to come from their soul, over many generations, firebenders decided to bend with hatred instead of the love of dragons. And thus firebending became more about getting angry than being spiritual. But because there's no defensive measures to firebending, firebenders have to unleash constant successive volleys of fire at opponents. And this requires a massive flow of energy and chi. And you want to know what's some bullshit? Firebenders can fly. Like, skilled firebenders can use fire to fly. Does it make sense? Absolutely. Should airbenders be able to do it at a higher rate than just 2 of them in history? Also, absolutely. However, firebenders, like waterbenders, are dependent on a couple of things for their strength. Firebending is strongest at high noon, because firebending is reliant on the sun, while firebending is weak during the night. And just like how waterbending becomes ineffective during a lunar eclipse, firebending becomes ineffective during a solar eclipse. However, should a comet pass closely by the Earth, firebending is boosted even further, because the comet is burning up in the atmosphere. Now, firebenders, a lot like waterbenders, can have control over the heat of their fire, with particularly talented firebenders being able to make their fire way hotter. We saw this with Azula. Now, why you need your fire to be hotter? Not entirely sure. Fire's still gonna hurt if it hits you. Doesn't matter if it's a campfire or plasma, I'd rather not be hit with it. And Firebending has 3 sub-skills: combustion bending, generating, and redirecting lightning. Remember when we talked about psychic bending earlier? That was in regards to combustion bending, an ability used by Combustion Man in Peely. This allows users of combustion bending to generate heat into a specific area, which in the 2 times that we've seen it is a tattooed eye in the middle of their forehead. By compiling all of the heat in their body to the specified spot, the combustion bender can shoot a laser of combustion out of their forehead, and this laser of fire will explode when it comes into contact with anything. And since this laser is technically just fire bending, it can be bent and controlled. And since it's highly concentrated fire bending, the combustion can destroy hill-sized boulders or completely evaporate entire bodies of water in an instant. But just because you can bend combustions does not mean you are invulnerable to them. Ask Peely about that one. Now, as for generating and redirecting lightning, it's a bit of a stretch in terms of fire bending, for me at least, but it's basically exactly what it sounds like. In order for a firebender to create lightning, they have to separate their positive and negative energies within themselves. And once you separate the positive and negative energies of your chi, you can direct the lightning from your core and out of your fingertips. Now, these negative and positive energies are usually referred to as yin and yang. And by separating them and devoiding yourself of all emotions and thoughts, you can control lightning. However, if you're ineffectual in the separation of yin and yang, or your mind is clouded, you won't be able to generate lightning, or you will be able to generate lightning, but it will kill you. The thing about controlling lightning, though, is you don't have nearly as much control as you do over any of the other elements. In fact, it's stated by Iroh that you don't control the lightning, you simply guide it in a location. You see, lightning bending was actually thought to be lost until the era of Avatar Kyoshi, as Kyoshi was actually struck by lightning generated by a firebender. Now, redirecting lightning is a different thing entirely, and is actually closer to waterbending than it is firebending. See, by accepting the flow of lightning, channeling it into your core, and then driving it out your other hand, you can redirect the flow of lightning in a desirable position. And this is exactly how waterbenders fight, accepting the energy of their opponent and redirecting it back at them. However, very similarly to generating lightning, if your mind is clouded or you don't mix the lightning into your core and direct it out in the correct way, this can kill you. And that's it. Basically everything you need to know about bending in Avatar. Obviously, I could do a deep dive into blood bending and lightning bending and a bunch of other things, but this video is a feeler, a tester if you shall. So tell me, guys, if you want me to cover more Avatar in the comments below, and also tell me, what element do you think I would bend? I know there's one I want. I feel as though I haven't hinted at it during this video. So based off my personality, what would I bend? This is very important to me, please. And while you guys are down there in those comments, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. I'll give you a hint. It's not energy bending.